Let me introduce myself. My name is Satu Lemay, and I'm the Vice President of the Center, and I direct the Washington program of East West Center. But what we're really here for is to hear from our colleague from a very, very well-known institution in Singapore, the Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University. As many of you will know, it's one of the leading institutions for higher learning in Singapore, but in particular has a very, very high reputation think tank and research center on international relations, which offers degree programs. And so that institution is fortunate to have someone like Assistant Professor Stephanie Kam, who I've met many times with her and her colleagues, both in Singapore, and in fact they were here last week, some of them, taking the pulse of the new situation in Washington. And when I was emailing with Stephanie, she said she's going to stay on a little bit longer and is willing to talk about perspective, personal perspective, but a well-informed perspective from Singapore and her institution about what's going on in Singapore and U.S.-China competition. And some of you will have seen that the Defense Minister of Singapore gave a talk just a couple of days ago in which he stated, and I quote, the U.S. has now willy-nilly, the image has changed from liberator to great disruptor to a landlord seeking rent. And needless to say, such a pronouncement from the Singapore Defense Minister is quite significant because, as many of you also know, Singapore is one of our key strategic framework partners in the region. We have an extensive defense, military security, trade relationship, investment relationship with Singapore. It's one of only 4 countries in the region with whom we have a free trade agreement, for example. And so it's kind of a very interesting time to take a look at U.S.-Singapore relations, Singapore's view of the region it's in, and we're delighted to have Stephanie here to share those perspectives. We'll ask her to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then we really do want to have quite an open and robust discussion. Very informal, we're not live streaming. Are we on the record? We are on the record. And when we get to Q&A, I'll simply ask you to identify yourself and your affiliation when you pose a question or a comment to Stephanie. With that, Stephanie, welcome. Thank you so much for doing this. Please.
Thank you so much, Satu, for the really warm welcome. It's my first work trip here in DC, and very pleasantly welcomed by the snowstorm last week. So a big change from the warmth and humidity in Singapore, as you know, some of you who have traveled to Singapore might be familiar. So I will maybe start off my 20-minute remarks with some comments on Singapore's foreign policy approach and the challenges that it's facing, and then open it up to questions, which I hope will be really fruitful, and I'm looking forward to. So maybe I'll start with that. I'll just start with this map here. When I was thinking about Singapore's size in relation to Washington DC, as you can see here, Singapore is approximately 719 square kilometers, and to put that in perspective, DC is approximately 177 square kilometers. But then, if you look at it in a much broader perspective, in relation to the entire USA, of course, Singapore is really small, as you can see. And population-wise, according to the Department of Statistics, it's about 6.36 million. In comparison, in DC, of course, very much spread out. It's 702,250. So that kind of gives you a sense of Singapore's geographical size and also the population. So I'd like to maybe touch more first more on Singapore as a small state. Singapore, I think, is a prime example of how a small state can navigate the complexities of international relations. So it has used both smart and soft power to advance its national interests on the global stage. So for instance, participation in multilateral institutions such as the United Nations, ASEAN, these all are indications of how small states can actually leverage international frameworks to shape global outcomes. And of course, Singapore engages in coalition building, strategic diplomacy as approaches part of its foreign policy toolkit. And these are actually part of what small states do in order to punch above their weight. But of course, these also raise the question about whether such strategies are sustainable, whether small states like Singapore can continue to rely on such strategies in a time of changing geopolitical configurations and also great power rivalry, or do they simply offer a temporary leverage in a system that's dominated by major powers in currently US-China conflict? So in terms of Singapore's foreign policy, as I mentioned, I would characterize Singapore's foreign policy along three lines. A hedging strategy essentially that maximizes flexibility, policy independence, and economic diversification. So in terms of flexibility, Singapore adapts to changing global conditions. So an example would be the COVID-19 pandemic, with Singapore adapted quickly by implementing financial support packages, accelerating its transition to a digital economy, and pursued the digital economy agreements with countries like Chile and New Zealand, as well as facilitating cross-border digital trade and positioning Singapore as a leader in the digital age. As US-China tensions have intensified, Singapore has also responded by deepening its economic ties with other regions such as India, EU, and the Middle East. So it sees such diversification of economic partnerships as a means to mitigate risks associated with geopolitical competition, at the same time broadening Singapore's strategic options. Domestically, we also see the Singapore government implementing immigration policies to adapt to the local condition. For instance, regularly adjusting its work pass requirements to balance the need for both local employment with imperative to attract global talent. This is seen as a means to maintain a competitive workforce while at the same time addressing domestic concerns about job security and social cohesion. But domestically, we've also seen rising anti-globalization sentiment and concerns about income inequality. Now that, of course, has prompted calls within the opposition for increased government intervention. So the budget 2025, for instance, we see has this renewed emphasis on supporting SMEs through tax relief, technology adoption, sustainability initiatives to address global disruptions and ensure economic resilience. In terms of global initiatives, Singapore also actively participates in initiatives like disarmament efforts, the Proliferation Security Initiative, which is a very active member, in order to reinforce its commitment to international peace and security. Singapore has continued to prioritize dialogue and pragmatic engagement, maintaining this dual reliance on US military protection and Chinese economic influence. But of course, under Trump's American First policy, Southeast Asian countries are anticipating increased tariffs and economic nationalism. And ASEAN countries, including Singapore, they are diversifying their economic ties through multilateral agreements such as the CPTPP and the RCEP. and public opinion in Singapore reflects more nuanced stance. While the general population views China favorably, political elites remain cautious about its long-term intentions, reflecting the country's careful diplomatic balancing act. So how much time do we have at this point?
Yeah,
I'm just mindful of the
take the
time.
time to lay out your main points.
Yeah. I also want to highlight the ISIS Institute of Southeast Asian survey. There's this general sentiment that the U.S. policy under the new administration towards the region will remain unchanged. So there's this sense that despite all the smoke and fire, the U.S. foreign policy approach will still remain largely unchanged from the Biden to the Trump administration. Both the Trump and Biden administrations, they prioritize the Indo-Pacific, but at the same time they failed to address Southeast Asian key concerns regarding the need for greater access to U.S. markets and a more measured approach to China. So Trump's personal relationships with foreign leaders tend to shape his approach to diplomacy. So leaders that he perceives as strong and as aligned with the U.S. interests, such as the Philippines and Indonesia's Prabowo, are more likely to receive greater attention in the road ahead. But most Southeast Asian leaders are likely to have a limited influence on U.S. policy. I'd like to show you this figure here that reflects China's the views of China by Southeast Asian countries in terms of how they view China as an economic power. So of course China since 2000s has overtaken Japan as the most influential economic power in ASEAN, and in the 2019 survey, 75% of the respondents identified China as the leading economic influence, and that perception has remained strong, but declined slightly in 2024 to 59.4%. But despite the decline, China still holds a substantial lead. If you look at this next figure here, you see that while the survey results suggest growing concerns about China's economic influence, and there's also a more welcoming attitude towards US involvement. So there is that sense that while China's economic influence is strong, there is still room for other actors, including the US, to play a greater role in the region. And in terms of trust, of course, we see here the trust in the United States. Including in this the idea of the liberal international order has significantly declined across Southeast Asia, dropping from 54.5% in 2023 to 42.4% in 2024. So this decline is observed in almost all ASEAN countries except the Philippines, which in fact experienced an increase in 4.3% in trust. So we might attribute this increase in trust to increased strengthened bilateral ties between the US and the Philippines through the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, and also President Trump's warm reception of President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. And it is quite striking that the substantial drops in trust towards the US also occurred in Laos, Cambodia, and also in Brunei. And among those who continue to trust the US, 45% cite its economic strength and political will as the primary reasons. But the 27% of the respondents believe that the US is too focused on its internal affairs to effectively address global issues, and that skepticism is further amplified by, of course, prior to this year, the elections in last year in November, and that also has, I believe, added further uncertainty with all that's going on now. So there is some trust, a decline in trust also in regards to China as well. And this is particularly due to its assertive actions in the South China Sea, and of course concerns over China's own slowing economic growth. And the most significant decline in trust towards China were reported in also in the countries, interestingly, that registered a drop in trust towards the US as well, Brunei, Cambodia, and Laos. So maybe I will stop here. I have prepared quite a number of points, but we can open up to questions, and I'm sure we'll touch on quite a number of the points that I prepared. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thanks so much. I think we're going to dig into some of these questions that you got received before the seminar, and I hope folks from around the room will also. But let me kick off with a sort of very pointed question, given your defense minister's statement the other day. Singapore has sort of predicated itself on, as you said yourself, two things that it expected. One is that the U.S. would be an upholder of the international system, and that Singapore could latch on to that international system, help its interests by participating in globalization, the reliability of the U.S. as a security guarantor, as you mentioned. But if that's changing, and I don't know that it is, but we have a lot of, in the last 31 days, a lot of change, and people are asking, well, how much globalization will there be? Will the U.S. retain its commitments to alliances, et cetera? Given those kinds of questions that are percolating, what are Singapore's options in this environment? What is it thinking about? Does it mean, you talked about hedging, but could we envision Singapore cutting deals with China in order to avoid getting on the bad side of China? Could we imagine Singapore saying ASEAN is not so helpful to us anymore, and we need to cut bilateral free trade deals with a whole range of independent players? What are some of the options that, and the second question, I know that's a big question, but really, so where is Singapore on this? I mean, we talked about the region, but Singapore is such a key player in the region. The second thing you said that caught my attention was you said the U.S. had, in citing these statistics, has been perceived as suboptimal on two key Singaporean or regional interests. One was lack of access to U.S. markets, and the second you said was U.S. has not moderated its policy towards China. So let me ask you a question. I don't foresee any big opening of U.S. markets, but there are considerations, discussions about whether the Trump administration is willing to make some kind of deals with China. How would Singapore feel about a U.S. Beijing ability to navigate and to cooperate in ways that heretofore have been mostly about strategic competition? And people allude to this so-called deal that could be made. I have no idea what the deal could be, but over Taiwan, over other issues. How would Singapore feel about that? So let me start with that, give time for others to develop their comments and questions, and then we'll go back to Stephanie.
Thank you very much, Satu, for these really great questions. I think these are all questions that are on probably a lot of my colleagues' minds as well, in Singapore, and I think in the broader region. So the first question about what are Singapore's options? I mean, I would say, going back to the points that I made about, Singapore's, neutrality and adherence to, the principles of neutrality, essentially not taking sides, right? But in terms of cutting deals, the first thing would be about cutting deals with China. Is that possible? Would that be possible? I think it depends on what type of deal are we, what type of deal would we be looking at? Currently, there is the possibility with the South China Sea. If you look at the issue, while we're really trying to push for a binding code of conduct, there have been issues, and that have to do mainly with the lack of unity within ASEAN. I'm sure you've heard of this many times. That China is willing to sign this agreement, but if the ASEAN member states do not simply have an agreement on the issue, then there's no point in that. But in terms of whether Singapore will continue to work with ASEAN, I think yes, the answer would be yes. Singapore will continue to want to work through ASEAN frameworks, and that's preferred, much the preferable route than I think BRICS or Quad or any other multilateral alternatives. That brings the question of whether these multilateral institutions that are introduced, whether they actually add value to ASEAN, since ASEAN is essentially the core of Southeast Asian countries. So I think Singapore will continue to try to work within the ASEAN, ASEAN +1, ASEAN +3 frameworks in order to advance the region's interests and of course its own national interests while upholding its sovereignty and neutrality. In relation to the second point about Trump's, I think there were a couple of questions about U.S. dissatisfaction with the U.S. Suboptimal influence in the region. Firstly, in relation to the access to U.S. markets. I think that's a legitimate point, particularly under the America First policy, which really aims to, at the heart of it, is to drive domestic industrial policy rather than and to create opportunities for jobs and so on. So the Southeast Asian countries do not really become a priority in terms of investment. But I think there is room, particularly in the digital space, with digital tech, especially. As you've heard with the recent revelation of Singapore being used as an intermediary state to circumvent export restrictions. I think that is an opportunity for the U.S. to think more seriously about working with, looking at third-party countries as opportunities to work with rather than as threats or strategic adversaries. So that could be one avenue in which U.S. firms potentially could move in through maybe some kind of public-private partnership. In terms of the South China Sea policy and the moderating approach, I think if you ask, it really varies across the spectrum, right? If you ask the Philippines, that very closely allied to the U.S., they would say that there is a need for a stronger deterrent against China's assertive and aggressive actions in the South China Sea. But if you ask a country like Singapore, then you have a different response. So I would say that response varies and is really hard to generalize that all of Southeast Asia want the U.S. to moderate its policies or its approach towards China. So I think if we look at the South China Sea, I think we're really looking to work through the ASEAN and try to resolve the issue within as an intra-regional through intra-regional mechanisms rather than allow external actors from interfering, even in the name of protecting the free and open Indo-Pacific. So I think that would be my response to that. And in terms of the deal, I mean, I've heard this term floating around, and to be honest, I don't really, I don't really see that this term makes a lot of sense. What exactly this deal entails. I know, experts like Bonnie Glasser has written something on that. I'm not an expert on Taiwan, so I wouldn't be able to comment on how, but it looks like on the one hand, China looks like it's ready to come to the table to slowly, talk. Beijing, through, I think, maybe not official channels, maybe through other channels informally. But the issue seems also to be whether it's easy to get to Trump and whether the Trump administration, who in the Trump administration would be the person to which, to make this deal with. And even if Taiwan is on the top of the agenda, given all the, talk about USA budget cuts and all that, that's so much that has dominated the headline so much that I wonder if Taiwan is even on the top of Trump's list. So I think I'll just leave it at that. That would be my response.
Thank you, Stephanie. Floor is open. We'll just go around the room with starting with Tom Reckford. Tom, you want to introduce yourself and then we'll go around.
We have a mic for you if you'd like.
Sorry. Oh, they need a mic. Yeah.
I have a pretty loud voice. Okay. Tom Reckford with the Foreign Policy Discussion Group and the Malaysia America Society. And by the way, let me just say in passing, I find the products of RSIS wonderfully useful in trying to understand what's going on in Asian countries. Excellent work. We'd be lost without them. My question is, Singapore has invested a lot in China over the years, and I wonder what's happened to the investments. How successful are they? Are they growing or receding, given the changing economic conditions in China?
Shall we take one or two, or you want to answer each one?
Yeah, sure, I can take this one.
Okay, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question and the compliments. I'll take that back to my colleagues and let them know. Yeah. So with I know of two major products of this cooperation between China and Singapore. One of which is the China-Singapore Suzhou Industrial Park. That, as far as I understand, is doing quite well. It's gained quite a bit of traction, and I think Malaysia is also trying to emulate that in some ways. But I'm not sure how successful it is. From the last time I talked to one of my interlocutors in Malaysia, it looks like it's completely different ballgame we're talking about, because in Malaysia you have the issue of like domestic political dynamics. There are all these local governance issues, and there is the issue also of the national federal, the split between the different states, and how the government at the top would want to implement projects. So I think with the Singapore case is quite straightforward. That one is doing fine. The other one I believe would be the Shenzhen Singapore corridor. I think that one is still ongoing in talks. It looks like the area that they're looking at to really expand would be tech, in the area of digital tech and connectivity. So I believe that's doing well, of course, thanks to the good trade relations between the two countries. Yeah, that's, I would say that.
Let's go around and please introduce yourself and your affiliation and then.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Ken. I'm Sarah from TechPro in Washington, D.C. We have seen recently that a lot of world leaders, including like Japan's and India Prime Minister, have come to Washington, D.C. to offer more more incentives, or they at least put on the offer for the U.S. to kind of avoid those tariffs or the upcoming to strengthen those the relations between U.S. and those countries. So is the Singaporean government currently thinking of any announcement or any plans to strengthen economically with the U.S., or doesn't have to feel the emergency since the trading with the U.S. is not so based on merchandise? Thank you.
I haven't looked at the that in very much detail, but as far as I understand, tariffs is one area that that the Singapore government is concerned about. So understandably, I mean the value proposition. I don't know if the Singapore government the ministers will come up with some kind of value proposition to, but also Japan and India. These are major players, right? So. Yeah, I don't have any particular insight to that, yeah.
But can I just build on that a little bit? Singapore has elections coming up. People are saying that it's likely to be by May. Exact date TBD. But Singapore purchases a lot of American military hardware. Singapore offers logistics hubs to the United States. Singapore parks more of its Air Force and its military in the United States than it does in any other country in the world. Even if I'm not mistaken, there's maybe even more than in Singapore itself. So there are a number of ways in which Singapore can use those tools to engage the U.S. Do you foresee appetite in Singapore for doing more in response to this uncertain time by saying, oh, we will buy more military equipment, oh, we will give you more access to military facilities in Singapore, we will do more exercises, as some countries are making overtures. Is that something you can anticipate in Singapore?
Yeah, I think that's something that we can anticipate. I mean, if push comes to shove, right? If there is that Singapore's put in a position where it has to really value proposition itself. I think that could be something. So yeah, thanks for the suggestion. Yeah.
Who was next on this side? Okay, over at the end then, please, sir.
Thank you. My name is Roger Cochetti, and I'm here representing myself. And since you used ASEAN as a framework for much of your discussion, I'm going to take the liberty of asking you about one of your neighbors in Southeast Asia, because it, from the point of view of a casual observer, seems to be a bundle of contradictions. And it's an important player, but it's very difficult to understand, and that is Vietnam. This, of course, is the exact same government that defeated the United States in the Vietnam War. It's not a different government, it's the same government. They are constitutionally communist and therefore ideologically probably closer to Cuba and China than any other country. They are one of the largest and fastest growing exporters to the United States, and probably the country most likely to benefit from increased trade tensions between the United States and China. They seem to be frenemies with both the United States and with China. So could you help us understand the role of Vietnam in the context of Southeast Asia and the many apparent contradictions in its relationships with both China and the United States, and then perhaps also Singapore's relationship with Vietnam? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Roger, for your question about Vietnam, which I'm really not expert on, and I mean, I know the person that comes to mind is Big Trump.
Yeah.
But as far as I know, yeah, you're completely right about the observation that ideologically Vietnam is more aligned with China, but economically is much closer to the U.S. But I do think that I read in recent times that Vietnam is also concerned about tariffs by the U.S. and also Trump has criticized Vietnam as well for with some of its for this trade surplus with the U.S. So I think Vietnam, I think is trying to also diversify and not get too enmeshed in the U.S.-China trade war. Yeah, that's my observation about that.
I have one more question, also related here.
Please.
I have one more questions, and we will talk about the Vietnam.
Could you
and
please introduce yourself?
Oh yeah, my name is Richard. I'm from World Bank. When we talk about the Vietnam and the South China Sea, and right now Vietnam is a massive reclaimed islands in South China Sea, and we always focus on the competition between China and the Philippines. But I see there's nobody claim or nobody, not even China, to do the diplomatic protest against Vietnam, and not the international news about that. I see the Vietnam just the reclaimed island like south of the water island. China claimed more close to Singapore with military base with runway that's longer than 13,000 feet. And all this military build up by Vietnam, and I want to see what's the Singapore's position on that, and also what Singapore's thinking between Vietnam and China regarding the South China Sea.
I don't think it's fair to ask Stephanie to talk too much about Vietnam, since this was a program on Singapore perspectives, but maybe you could say something about Singapore's view about Vietnam's actions in the South China Sea. Because you did talk about Singapore's approach for intra-regional approaches to the South China Sea. So what kinds of discussions is Singapore having in the region with countries such as Vietnam, which is employment, or with Philippines, or with Brunei, or with Malaysia for that matter?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not able to comment on this because I'm not really a maritime expert, so I don't follow the developments as closely as some of my other colleagues. So yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, Aryan, please. We'll come back to you. Sorry, I didn't see your hand. Sorry.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm Aryan from the East West Center. I was wondering whether you could comment on a more general picture of Singapore's foreign policy. I think Kishore Mahbubani, who was a former foreign secretary, said recently that the Western world needs to realize the importance of 3 M's, that the world is multipolar, multilateral, and multi-civilizational. And I was just wondering, considering this topic of US, China, and Singapore, what is Singapore's worldview on the 3 M's?
Multipolar, multilateral, and multi-civilizational.
Okay, so the first point about the multipolarism, I think increasingly as we're seeing this, as mentioned, the U.S.-China tensions play out. Multipolarism is something that a fact that we all have to live with. The world is no longer bipolar, as we would like to think, but countries are diversifying for strategic reasons. Even countries like Singapore, they're resorting to multipolarism, cooperating with not just US and China, but also with India, Japan, other partners in the EU as well. So I would say that multipolarism is a fact, and I think Zach Cooper he wrote in a recent commentary for RSIS that the US just has to accept that the world is no longer bipolar, and that we're moving towards multipolarity. In terms of the second point about multilateralism, I think that speaks to the increased Quad, for example, and BRICS, for another example, to kind of create new different blocks in different parts of the world. So I mean, I would completely agree that as the world shifts towards more multipolarity, multilateralism will become increasing among countries within the region, across the region. And then multi-civilizational, I mean, there's a lot of room for cross-civilizational dialogue, with the U.S., with China. I mean, recently I saw in the news the reports that the U.S. was pulling out some of its staff from the embassy in China to kind of reduce that. So and that will really have implications on the opportunities for exchange across the two countries. And if that's what we're seeing in an age of increasing geopolitical complexity, then that's a worrying trend. So yeah, I would just make these comments. I'm sure Kishore had probably much more to elaborate on these points. Yeah.
It's Ari, I would just note that the Singapore Defense Minister, Dr. Ng, said, and I'm quoting from his speech that's posted on the Singapore Defense Ministry, because you asked about multipolarity. Here's what the Defense Minister of Singapore said day before yesterday or 3 days ago. It is that America's primacy is becoming the overriding consideration. Not that it never was, but I think it has now become the pole star of foreign policy, even at the expense of bilateral ties or multilaterals. There's a little bit different view from Kishore's assessment of multipolarity. Sir, you had a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, please, if you could just identify yourself.
Hi, thank you. My name is Andres. I'm a PhD student in Diplomacy and International Relations. I've finished my coursework and about to start my dissertation. So, my question is how the changing global dynamics, especially the multipolarity, the economic leverage of China, and conditional aid to developing countries would affect the foreign policy of United States of America and other countries, especially the Southeast Asian countries, including Singapore.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah, that's a good question. I'd just like to tie that question with the pre-submitted questions. I think that ties in with one of the questions. And the question that this person posed was, how does China's provision of unconditional aid influence the political and economic landscape of developing countries, and in relation to democracy, institutional stability, and human rights. So, there are a couple of things. When we think about the Chinese aid, there have been works written on this. In fact, the China's provision of unconditional aid has, is quite different from the U.S. aid. This form of assistance actually blends ODA, official development assistance, with what China calls South-to-South cooperation, and that kind of reflects China's identity as a developing country and also as a global power. So it's presented as unconditional. So to this person's question, particularly that the China provides unconditional aid, but it's actually in fact shaped by a mix of economic and political interests that have ties to China's own national priorities. It's typically funneled through the Ministry of Commerce. It focuses on economic interests rather than developmental-driven goals, as seen in the traditional ODA models. And unlike the Development Assistance Committee donors, the traditional Development Assistance Committee donors that have moved away from aid tying. China often specifies procurement requirements that favor its own industries to ensure a significant portion of the aid is spent within China. Right. So when that's on the Chinese side of the story, when it comes to the U.S. aid, approach is different, of course. So back to your point, I was trying to tie in with the question here. But the U.S. aid's cut back on the funding will have significant implications for Southeast Asian countries, to put it simply. There are a number of countries in Southeast Asia, like Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, that depend on aid packages, U.S. aid, and that from refugees, health care, vaccines, and what aid cutback would mean is that these countries will be left on their own, essentially, without the aid support. So it is quite remarkable and tragic to hear that as well. So with that in mind, it looks like these countries might have to turn to other alternatives, look to other developmental assistance partners to fill in the vacuum. That's the story about the aid in terms of its impact in Southeast Asia.
Could I ask in that context that Singapore is by any metric, international metric, a very advanced developed country with high income levels. Could you foresee your government increasing its aid package to poorer countries in its neighborhood, particularly developing countries in ASEAN such as Laos or Cambodia, for that matter, Myanmar for that matter? Would there be opposition to that in Singapore? Would the political class and the public think that's money well spent to try and develop the region around it so that it offers markets and opportunities for Singaporean businesses and traders and what have you?
So the first part about state capacity and willingness, political willingness, I guess, more on that end to try and help the developing countries, given that Singapore is often labeled as a global north country in the midst of global south countries. I think that if there are channels and there are avenues through which Singapore can provide that kind of supporting role in terms of aid, but nowhere near the U.S. of course. But so we've seen a number of initiatives that are already in progress or underway, and one example would be in the area of digital connectivity. Because I'm interested in that area, and so kind of looking into that. One area where actually the U.S. and Singapore has done really well is in the area of smart cities. So U.S. ASEAN Smart Cities Partnership, that's one example of a really, I think, a vital initiative that promotes ethical AI use, sets digital governance standards across Southeast Asia. It's particularly welcomed by countries like Singapore, as you can imagine, namely because it tries to promote this good standards, uphold ethical AI use, and so what this initiative does is that it aims to support ASEAN cities. It provides training, facilitating exchanges, assisting in securing financing for projects, focusing on fostering public-private partnerships, promoting best practices in urban development. And the projects under this partnership are specifically tailored to the needs of 26 pilot cities within the ASEAN Smart City Network. This ensures that they are, they develop collaboratively with these cities' interests in mind. And of course, the U.S. is helping ASEAN countries through this partnership to enhance their smart city, infrastructure, digital governance, which is, I mean, really important digital connectivity in the countries like the Philippines, for example. You know, and this is to the point about, you know, to preempt the, you know, recommendations for the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific. You know, the U.S. can also capitalize on this slower rollout of 5G in Southeast Asia, given that, you know, the ASEAN region is, you know, quite fragmented in terms of, you know, how well each country is in terms of digital development. So, and the U.S. can invest in these areas, you know, can pick up the pace to, you know, to compete with China. And in order to solidify its position as a reliable partner. There are other initiatives as well, I believe, in the tech space, apart from the US ASEAN smart cities, that focus on training, you know, exchange and training across between Singapore and the US, and also within ASEAN. Southeast Asia also has the, you know, I mentioned the Digital Economy Framework Agreement, the DIFA, which is important agreement that helps to, you know, advance good governance in practices in tech. So that could be, I think, one potential area that which Singapore can really work to push for development and help to improve the, you know, the standards of living in the poorer countries. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'd kind of forgotten about it, but thank you for reminding us about Singapore's work on the digital side and on the smart cities partnership. Anyone? Yes, please, here. And then this young fellow here, please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jenna Lismar from the US Asia Institute. You guys mentioned economic diversification, and you've seen that in Singapore, but also Malaysia and Indonesia turning to Japan, India, Australia, and the likes. Would Singapore anticipate a response or even retaliation from the US and China when those countries are breaking away from that power competition?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, yeah, I think it's an interesting question because I mean that question assumes that, you know, Singapore, you know, the U.S. and China working, you know, specifically with the ASEAN countries in mind, the Southeast Asian countries in mind when they compete. But onto the other point, you're right that, you know, Southeast Asian countries are diversifying, and I don't necessarily see that the U.S. and China are trying to prevent or stop these countries from, you know, diversifying with other partners. In fact, there could be, you know, beyond bilateral engagements, there could be a possibility for, you know, China to work with Singapore and, you know, a third country, or the U.S. to work with Singapore and a third country, that sort of arrangement, and that not necessarily preclude the kind of bilateral arrangements. But unfortunately, it looks like a lot of these exchanges and agreements are on a bilateral basis. So there's some hope for that. But yeah, I guess we have to see.
I think you had a question. Was there anyone else? Because I think we're at the sort of tail end of our time, so I want to make sure I get everyone who had a comment or question in. Anyone? Our YPPs? No. Okay, please.
Okay, so I do have a very novice question.
Could you just
yes.
introduce yourself?
Yes, I will. So my name is Richard Olatunji. I really did not have anything to do with, you know, diplomacy or my field is very different. I'm a student pilot, so it's, you know, something totally different from what we're talking about. But my novice question is, in a situation where the U.S. and China have equal influence on the continent, who would Singapore side with? Is Singapore more aligned with the US, or are they more aligned with China, in a situation like that?
In what situation?
So in a situation where the United States and China have equal influence on the continent, where would Singapore align with, if that makes sense?
I think that's a question in the IC survey,
In the IC survey, oh, yeah.
right? Specifically, which side would a country come
Yeah,
down on?
so the IC survey, I believe that most countries would side with was it the US or with China? I can't.
I'd
can't
have to
remember.
look up each country, but I
Yeah.
remember that specific question in the most recent survey.
Yeah, I believe that there was that question, and I remember it being I think it might be China or the US. I really can't remember now, but it's a very close fight. I believe it's like almost like head to head. I mean, you can have a look at the IC survey, the report. It's fairly comprehensive. Well, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because when it comes to, a lot of these global human rights norms and all that, you can see that, I mean, China still has a way to go in terms of the credibility gaining, even with the BRI, and that's the reason why, it's kind of scaled down talking about the BRI and talking about more small and beautiful projects rather than large infrastructure projects, which are still ongoing, but it's really tapered off since the negative publicity on the BRI. There is also, if you think about the issue, the BRICS, there is, and China's overtures to the global south, there are lots of challenges, including, how Chinese companies, do things. So there is that still that I think that that issue that tend to associate China with, and for that reason, the U.S. is still, I think in terms of leading global standards on human rights norms and democracy is still up there. So I would say I would choose the U.S. But with the current Trump administration, it looks like we're moving towards away from a retrenchment of democracy and human rights ideals. We're looking to more protectionist economic nationalism. So it's a really a question mark. I think if you ask not just me, I think if you ask other observers, they would tell you that it's quite hard to choose now as well. Yeah.
According to the survey in 2024, on the specific question, ASEAN should continue its position of not siding with China or the U.S. 36% of Singaporeans believe that Singapore should choose the position of not siding with either side, which means obviously that almost 70%, or a little less than 65%, think they should side with one or the other. And then if you go further down in the relationship, you see that most countries, Singapore in particular, I think, is likely to side with the United States. But it depends on the conditions. It's a big question. Okay, final question, last question, and then we have to break up. Yep.
I'm Daniela Sussman, former UN, now a global engagement advisor. Dr. Limai, you talked about Singapore's relationship with the US in terms of defense, and as you know, Dr. Kam, recently US was quite concerned about the Panama Canal, the role of the Chinese in managing the canal. And considering that Singapore has such close ties with the US in terms of military and defense sector, do you foresee any tension between Singapore and China because of this close collaboration with the US? Thanks.
She's the speaker, so I'll defer the question to her. I mean, you know, if I understood correctly, given the close U.S.-Singapore military strategic framework agreement and all the different agreements Singapore and U.S. have on the military and defense side, does that give you, how do you handle that in your relations with China? How does China respond to that? And we know we have some empirical examples of how China responds to Singapore's relationship. Maybe you want to say a little bit about.
So how does Singapore manage the?
Yes. How does it manage to deal with China even though you have this very close defensive military relationship with the United States?
Yeah, okay, I mean, that's a good question. Yeah, so Singapore, I'm not sure what the Panama Canal reference was. I was a bit confused by that.
Well, as you know, Secretary Rubio was in Panama.
Yeah.
Talking about China managing the canal. They were quite concerned, there were some tensions. So looking at the dynamics right now, when you look at the relationship between Singapore and its location to China, geographically, how do you foresee that changing?
I will just say that all countries are managing their relationships between the U.S. and China. So many of our alliance partners, I just note that we have alliance relations. The United States has alliance relationships with Australia, Japan, ROK, NATO, many countries, very strong relations. But all of these countries also still manage their relations with China. In many cases, having trade relations with China, which far surpass U.S. trade relationships. So the ability to manage for Singapore is, maybe we'll ask Stephanie to say, how does Singapore itself do that?
So so with, I mean, you know, the comparison between Latin America and Southeast Asia is, I mean, I don't know if we're, you know, it's a, you know, different, you know, we're talking about really different geographical regions here, right? You know, ASEAN or Southeast Asia, Singapore, more specifically, we've had you know, close ties with China and the U.S. Both countries, you know, as you mentioned, close defense ties with the U.S. But also, as and where it see fits, it cooperates closely on economic ties with China. So I mean, the question about how it navigates, I mean, it goes back to the point about you know Singapore's role in hedging, right? On the one hand, it cooperates on defense issues and then in economic issues, but it is also finding its path, right? So you can also call, you know, Singapore pathfinder of some sorts, even as a small state with, you know, these digital tech agreements, as I mentioned, and it's really trying to pave a way for itself while, you know, trying to maintain an independent policy stance. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but I do think that Singapore has used its relations with China to sometimes to push for certain you know, things, and including using its leverage as a you know, a small state to host events like the Trump-Kim Summit, for example, and the Shangri-La Dialogue. So all these avenues also kind of signal its you know, desire to play you know, take a neutral position, a middle position, and that is really also continuing from the legacy from Lee Kuan Yew, Ho Chok Tong, and hopefully in the road ahead in the current administration under Lawrence Wong. As you know, Senior Minister Lee Hsien Loong is playing a very, you know, in the background and also in the front lines as well, actively, you know, ensuring policy continuity, sustainability of, you know, of Singapore's foreign policy, and I think one of the member of the audience might know is, you know, really the work of Singapore is not just confined to one single administration. It's the work of generations. So when we think of, you know, the Singapore success story, there needs to be some kind of continuity, and that really goes back to, I think, the predecessors, Lee Kuan Yew, and hopefully that will continue. But as a small state, going back to the original point, there is going to be challenges, and Singapore will just have to be nimble and flexible as it navigates the choppy waters in the years ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephanie. I want to, before we turn to thanks, Stephanie, I just want to say, please keep your eyes and ears open, because as we mentioned in the invitation, this is the 60th anniversary of the U.S.-Singapore relationship. Singapore is about to have elections in a few months' time. The Lawrence Wong administration of Prime Minister Lawrence Wong is even though the former Prime Minister is playing an important role and there's a kind of collective leadership and party continuity, this is an important inflection point for Singapore on a number of issues, both domestically in the region and in the new international environment. And so stay tuned, because I think there's going to be a lot more news out of Singapore, and it really is hard to underappreciate how important the U.S.-Singapore Strategic Framework Agreement has been up to date, and so we'll have to watch how that evolves coming ahead. I also want to say that it's great, Stephanie, that you were able to stay an extra week after your colleagues left. I'm sorry that we're giving you frigid cold weather and perhaps snow, but we're delighted that you were able to do this. We thank you for doing this and for your time. And I again want to share Tom's point, which I opened with, which is you and your institution are really valuable resources for our understanding of Southeast Asia, of Singapore, and of the broader region. And I want to thank you and RSIS for that. So please give my best wishes to your colleagues as well. Please thank Stephanie. Thank you so much.